evening and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and we are coming to you from the studio of Medgar Evers College over the airways of WNYE 91.5 FM. Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. And I'm very pleased to have in the studio with me today Annette Leach.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Brenda. This is
Thank
wonderful.
you for coming. And Annette is the author of a new book, Song of the Shaman.
Shaman.
I'm sorry, Song of the Shaman. She is a Brooklyn author who started out as a copywriter for an advertising agency. For years, she wrote magazine, radio, and TV ads for everything from soda to the CIA. Sounds very interesting,
Yeah.
particularly in these times, right?
Mm-hmm.
After winning industry awards and moving on to creative director, Annette decided it was time to write where her true passion lay, books. And not everyone has an opportunity to find and practice and become involved in their true passion. So
Yes,
you're very blessed to be able to do that.
definitely.
Right. She also founded the Black Literary Club, the first mail order book club devoted to African American, African and Caribbean literature. It garnered much success, but we'll talk about where that is now and what's happening with publishing. But first, we're going to talk about Song of the
Shaman.
Song of the Shaman, which we'll start by asking you, when we think of shamans, we think of things that are mystical, and your motivation for writing this very intriguing book. I read it in one day.
Oh,
I just couldn't put it down.
How wonderful. What a compliment. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wow.
You're welcome.
It's this book was a journey. It started several years ago when my boys were very little. And there were two things that inspired me. One was that when they were 3 or 4 years old, they started to tell me stories about where they were before they were born and their past lives. At the time, I was confused and was wondering where this information came from. I've always been interested in spiritual things and themes of identity. And at the same time, while they were telling me these stories, I discovered that my grandmother was adopted. It's something that my mother never spoke of, and neither did my grandmother. And I didn't know my grandmother very well. She lived in Jamaica for most of her life, but she was born in Panama. And she moved here when I was a teenager, and I remember observing her and thinking she was a very quiet woman, kept to herself most of the time. And I wondered why that was. I used to sit and watch her sew and just would see that she would be lost in a reverie most of the time. I felt that that's what she did to sort of withdraw into herself and away from the world, was to concentrate on her sewing. So what I decided to do when my mom told me that she was adopted and my mother became interested in trying to trace her family, it threw me into this genealogical search, and I discovered that her family might have come from the rainforest region in Panama and Costa Rica.
Yes.
And as I was researching that, and my younger son was telling me stories about a life that he had when he was an Indian. And it went on for a long time, and I listened to him. At first I thought it was just, he was just making stories up, or he watched something on television.
Right.
And but then the stories became very specific. And as I was researching my grandmother's history, and I saw that she had some indigenous background, I came up with the idea, the central question of my book, which is, what if your 10-year-old son knew more about your past than anyone in the world, including you?
Right. You know, in books, we authors often talk about what motivates them to write is to answer a question. And when you had your son telling you these stories, what was that like? How did he start that off? What was that process? Did he just say, I remember when? What would be an example of how that happened?
Um, the first time, both of them actually told me stories. That I'll tell you the about my younger son. One morning he came into the bed. He usually would get up in the morning and bring a book with him for me to read to him early in the morning before breakfast. So this morning he brought Dr. Seuss's book. It's called Are You My Mother?
Oh, okay. I'm not
Which
familiar with that
it's
one.
it's a famous Dr. Seuss. I read it a gazillion times to both of them, and he brought it over and he sat on my lap and we opened the book and I'm reading and he was a very quiet child. He didn't talk much, especially when I was reading. He was just listening and he's looking at the pages and he turns. I get to the end of the book, which is about a bird who's not sure who his mother is, and he asks a lot of different animals, "Are you my mother? Are you my mother?" At the end of the book, he closes it. He looks at me and he says, "Well, I know you're my mother because I saw you from before I was born, and I chose you."
Oh my goodness. How old
So
was
so
he?
he was about 3.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
and it was just a matter of fact. I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." And he says, "I saw you." And I said, "Well, what were you doing?" And he says, "Well, I was there waiting to jump. And I had to choose who I wanted my mother to be." So I said, "Well, so you saw me?" And he says, "Yes, when I saw you, I jumped and I slid down on a string." And he just demonstrated it for me. He says, "I had to slide down on the string, and it was very scary." And he says, and I said, "Well, how did you come into me? How did that happen?" And he says, "I slid down from the top of your head into the top of your head, all the way down inside of you."
Yeah, and you have
So,
that in the
and
story.
it's in the story
Yes,
too.
it's in your novel.
And and I was fascinated by this, and I was like, okay. Um, I had never considered that before. I thought about it for a long time. And he also, shortly after that, started telling me about his other family. He said, "Well, you were my mother now, but you weren't always my mother." And I said, "Well, who was I?" And he never completely answered that question. He would be silent. But then he would tell me that I always had my brother with me. And when I was in India, and I had a different family, and we went on hunts. He says my brother was always with me, and we went on these hunts together to find an animal. And he told me the story over and over and over again because I thought he's going to change it. He'll forget it. But as his story stayed consistent throughout his I'd say third, fourth, and maybe fifth year, um, 5 years old, I started to try to unpack it and process this. And the way that I know how to process things, and for me to understand something, is through my writing. So I started to write the story down, and it merged with a story about my grandmother. When I couldn't find all of the background on her family, I decided to write historical fiction to give her a history. And the two stories started to merge together because they both focused on identity and spirituality. And this is the story of one woman's spiritual awakening through the guidance of her child.
Right. And you really, those are the core themes in your book. Now, I thought you were going to also say that part of what you did to unpack this was to do research. So, but you obviously did research, which was probably alternative kinds of research. Can you talk a little bit about the research and the process you use to really construct this historical narrative and that's so deeply layered with spirituality and mysticism? I imagine you were reading all kinds of books.
Yes, I spent a lot of time at the Native American Museum downtown Manhattan in their research library because once I found out where where my grandmother's family name came from, I started to look into the various indigenous groups from that region, from the Talamancan region in Costa Rica and the rainforest region in Panama. And I got closer and closer to some of the rituals and practices, and they reminded me of what my son was telling me.
Okay.
And so it threw me into this kind of self-discovery and also an investigative kind of research that helped me merge the modern day story of a woman who was adopted and doesn't know her past and was raised by a Jewish family here in New York. And she makes a decision on her 35th birthday that she wants to have her own family. She wants to become a single mother and have a genetic child of her own to sort of start her bloodline. And little does she know that the son that she gives birth to knows where her family is from. He knows her ancestry, and he reveals it to her slowly over the course of the study. And through the research that I did on the historical fiction aspect of the book, helped me to understand past lives, helped me to understand the history that might have been where my grandmother was from, and also understand the reason why things happen today. The reason.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you are obviously incorporating a lot of spirituality that's based on more Eastern types of philosophy and religion. What in your background, when you talk about you were always interested in spiritual things, what in your background gave you the kind of experiences even to accept this as a premise, to accept what your son was telling you, or your sons were telling you?
I think that started with my mother, who she would tell us stories of ghosts and things that she saw
Okay.
when we were little. Things when she was born in Panama, and lived with her grandmother. And she told me stories about when her grandmother passed away. She came to visit her the same night. And not only did she see her, but her sisters, her two sisters, or when she was like 3 or 4 years old. She would tell me stories of other apparitions that she experienced in different homes that we lived in. And they were very matter of fact. I remember thinking, my mom sees these things. To me, they were frightening, but she wasn't frightened at all. She said that they're still here, but they shouldn't be here. They're wanting to visit us, and they want me to know that they're here. And I was raised Catholic and
And of
was
course,
confirmed, and yes, and all these
that's all.
things. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Sunday school, and my mother was Catholic also, but she had a different understanding of things, and she believed in reincarnation, and she knew that there was something that we don't understand here as physical beings. There's something beyond this that I'm hoping to understand through my writing.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting that that forms the premise of your book, because at the beginning of the book you contrast that with the very materialistic world that Sherry lives in. Would you like to share, reflect on that, and if you want to share an excerpt with our audience from your book?
Sure. Sherry is a New York City advertising executive. She spent all of her life identifying with physical, material things because she had no basis of history to draw from. She didn't have any connection to her adopted family, and felt disconnected and only connected through things that
Right.
she could purchase, that she could work on in her writing and in her art direction. She was an art director for an ad agency. So that became sort of her reality. And in order for her to switch from that, because she closed herself off from any spiritual understanding, she decided to have a child, not even knowing what was going to happen to her. And at the beginning of the book, it opens with her having her son in an emergency situation. And she's in a cab, in a yellow cab, racing towards the
Right.
hospital. So I'd like to read from the beginning of the
Okay.
book.
Okay. Thank you.
It's the book opens in 1996 in Brooklyn, New York. Zig was born on the Brooklyn Bridge in the back seat of a yellow taxicab. Sherry pushed him from her womb onto the slick vinyl seat, with century-old steel cables, limestone, and a cab driver as her sole witnesses. The small of Sherry's back bucked against the ashtray of one door. Her shoeless left foot dug into the floor of the cab. Her right leg, up on the seat and bent at the knee, banged against the backrest. Blood pooled inside her thighs. The cabbie's frightened eyes flashed at her in the rearview mirror. She glanced at his ID. The name was long and crammed with consonants. "I miss. Please, miss." He cussed himself and ran a hand through clumps of oily hair. Sherry's senses left her, jumping somewhere off the edge of the bridge. She screamed. The August night air was hot and foul. Around her the city boiled. Horns blared, trucks roared, and street hustlers shouted while the cabbie weaved through traffic. The faint lilt of Middle Eastern music wafted to Sherry's ears. Nothing had prepared her for this moment. Not the monotonous Lamaze classes, what to expect books, or birthing DVDs. All directives from her midwife were forgotten like yesterday's lunch. Tufts of white fiber hung from a gouge her fingernails had torn in the back seat. Her costly new maternity dress was hiked up under her breasts. The dappled street light revealed a prune-like face and wispy hair pasted to a round head. She quickly cleared his gummy mouth. Thread-thin fingers then stretched as Zig wailed. Eyes squeezed shut to the world, tiny arms quivering, he let out a newborn howl that plunged the depths of the East River. It was as intense and unwavering as a tribal call.
Okay. I love the way that ends, as intense and unwavering as a tribal call. And you really, really capture so strongly, very, very strong and powerful images of what that birth was like and why. The readers left this, it had to be very special.
Thank you.
Yes.
The tribal call is a little clue to
Yes,
to
foreshadowing
rest.
there.
Yes, a little.
Foreshadowing there. Which leads me into how you structured the book. I found that very interesting as to the parallel lives that we were witnessing as readers.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a real challenge because I wrote this book several different ways. Some editors suggested that I put all the historical fiction story at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Some thought that I should not alternate them as closely as possible, spread them. It was a real challenge to decide how to structure and tell this story. And then in the end, I decided that my first instinct was the right one, which was to do it the way that I did.
Yeah, I enjoyed that going back and forth. And your chapters were succinct enough so that you didn't get lost. Sometimes when that happens, you have to go back. But I just found it was easy for me as a reader to follow. And it always made you curious about the parallel lives. You could see the connections. It really helped to see the connections.
That's wonderful
Yeah.
to hear because I held my breath after it was published and said, "Oh my gosh, are people going to get this?"
No,
But
I know
wonderful.
that, I usually ask the writers about your writing being autobiographical, but I don't have to ask you that.
A lot of it is based on
Okay.
on stories that I experienced myself, but the overall story is completely fictionalized.
Right.
There's many things here
Mhm.
that I had to write in order to demonstrate the discovery of who Sherry Lambert, the main character, is.
Right.
The theme is what was real, and I think that in fiction, for many writers, their themes are quite true. They're real.
Right.
You can't make them up because they have to come from some truth inside of you.
Exactly. And that truth is always something that ends up being universal and something that other people can grab onto. You expressed it, but the whole search for inner strength, for peace, for finding oneself, the issues around race and identity, all of that came out very clearly in the book.
Yes.
But you've also lived other kinds of lives, as not only as a writer, but in the advertising industry, and then you started the book club. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the state of publishing, and where do you see the future going in terms of the writing by Black writers?
That's a good question. Um, so much is happening in publishing now that it's hard to even keep up. It seems to be changing like every day. You hear something else, another digital company opening up, another way of getting your work out there into the world, and how to protect your work. Should you do it yourself? Should you go traditionally? Um, I found this. Published my book myself. I had an agent that shopped it for me, and my genre is very different, and it was a challenge to find the right home for the book.
I can see, because you course speculative fiction, and then you do historical fiction, and you do spirituality. You have many elements in this book.
Yes, and sometimes that can work for you traditionally and against you, because if there's no comparative book to look to, then publishers kind of shy away. They're a little nervous about taking a chance. So I decided, because I have a background in advertising and marketing and book selling, and my husband encouraged me every day. He says that you should do this book yourself. You already know how to produce the book, and then you work on it. You can work on the marketing slowly until people are familiar with this genre that you're sort of creating. It's a hybrid of three different genres. And I'm glad that I did. It's an enormous amount of work. If you want to do this yourself, this my advice to other writers is that you get some help, someone to help you. But I think that is the way that this publishing world is going. It's going to be sort of like iTunes, where people will be selecting songs and not buying entire albums and CDs anymore. It's turning into a sort of a virtual library where people can pick and choose whatever they want. I think that's a great thing for readers. I don't know how wonderful it is for publishers.
Well, the playing field is being evened out. I would say. She said more writers are able to write, and I guess the challenge becomes, how do you evaluate, what's written? How do you ensure that what's written has the quality and the time that it takes? As you said, it took you quite some time to write this.
Yes.
And you obviously were very concerned about the craft and the quality of your work.
I've always been pretty detail-oriented person, so I spent a lot of time making sure that if I'm going to do this myself, that it has to be at the level of any other book that you would pick up in a bookstore. Right. And that was very important to me. So I found the professional experts that I needed to help me get it ready for the market. And I'm pleased with the way that it has progressed. I think the most important thing is to find your audience. If you're going to do this yourself, you have to find where the readers are, because you can produce a very beautiful book and everybody can admire it who's standing nearby looking at it. But how do you get it to people across the world? How do they even know that it exists?
Right. And as we come to a close, believe it or not, how would you suggest that you market this book? Who are your readers? Who are the people who have influenced you as a reader, and who do you see as your readers for Song of Shaman?
That's a loaded question. There are mothers that have experienced similar stories with their children, a lot of them. In fact, I'm going to be filmed for a program called Ghost Inside My Child. They're coming to shoot here in Brooklyn next week. And this is a show on Lifetime that is about children who remember previous lives. And I think that that is the greatest platform that I could have found in the most specific, based on my story, to get the word out there, because they will be discussing the book and how I wrote it on that show. So it is finding the people that are most interested, narrowing it down to the people who are most interested in your subject matter, as narrow as you can possibly get it, because you don't have to reach everyone. You have to reach the people who are interested in this subject matter.
Right, in your niche.
In the niche.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And who are you reading?
Who am I reading now?
Okay.
You know, I've been reading a lot of Eckhart Tolle. He's, to me, a modern-day mystic, and he speaks the truth in such clarity that I know that after having written this book, and I wrote this book after I even found out about him, that I did the right thing.
Okay.
The truth that was inside of me came through, and I just enjoy a lot of spiritual writings. Paramahansa Yogananda is another one that he wrote the autobiography of a yogi. Wonderful spiritual teacher. Fiction-wise, I read all kinds of things, and I really like the classics. I like Nabokov. I like Balzac. I like Toni Morrison. I like Langston Hughes. So it sort of runs the gamut, fiction. But usually those writers are the ones that they speak so closely to things that I feel are true in my life. Even though they're fiction, the themes are always close to my heart.
Well, thank you so much. I've been speaking to Annette Leach, and she is the author of Song of the Shaman. And how do we get that book?
It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and a lot of the local bookstores here in New York, as well as in other cities too, and in many of the chain stores. It's in Barnes & Noble also.
Oh, thank you. So I want to encourage our listening audience to go out and support our writer, Annette Leach, and purchase Song of the Shaman. And I want to encourage you to come back next week. This is Brenda Greene, host of Writers on Writing. I want to thank my engineer, Fritz, for coming out and supporting us always. And I want to encourage you to come back next week. Remember, the writer's always reading, the reader's always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. Dr. Brenda Greene, signing off.
Next song was inspired by a poem written by Langston Hughes. I'm sure most of you have heard of Langston Hughes. And he wrote a poem about rivers, and we call this song I've Known Rivers.